am so incredibly excited to be joined today by Elliott Morris. Elliott writes the terrific Substack Strength in Numbers. He is a brilliant public opinion poller. He previously worked at 538 and ran a bunch of amazing data journalism at ABC until, unfortunately, they shut down a lot of the 538 work. But Elliot, it is so terrific to have you join us today on American Inequality.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. I
Um,
followed your charts for some time. I think you're like, in terms of charts per newsletter, you've got to be right up there next to Strength in Numbers
I try and keep the
or higher.
charts, yes, ratio high, maps in particular. People love
Maps are
the
great.
maps. Yes. You know where you live, where your ex-girlfriend lives. People love to, kind of see all that stuff. And so but it's
I don't know where
yeah,
my ex-girlfriend lives, to be totally
people know. They
true.
love to zoom in to be like, what's the life expectancy in that area?
Yeah.
Um but I was very excited to reach out and set this up because, I think there's so much terrific data journalism that you do and really helping explain what is, going on in policy, in the economy, where we're seeing a lot of these, disconnects in the data from what people are experiencing. And I really want to start us there because you've been doing a lot of fantastic writing about this, data disconnect. And in particular, you wrote this piece a few weeks ago, kind of taking on the Stancil argument, this argument from Will Stancil about this view that if only people actually believed that the economy was better, that if we weren't hearing so much negative sentiment about how bad the economy was, that people would actually feel that things were better. And you sort of did this brilliant takedown of the Stancil argument. And so, if you can start us off by saying a bit more about the argument, why it is, wrong, and sort of what you started to observe in some of those, charts and analysis there.
Sure. Well, I'll start off by saying um, my memory is just terrible. So I did have to go back and reread this. I mean, I'm writing like 3,000 word articles a week now. I should probably make this a book. Um, so some of the nuances do get lost. Like at least to the extent that there is a counter argument here that has been fleshed out, it is unfortunately on social media and like Blue Sky in particular. Um, and by argument here, I mean the very particular argument from, yeah, you named Will Stancil. He's one of the people, but I think just like there is a contingent on the Blue Sky left at this point that likes to raise the argument that our uh, economic statistics that are based on surveys that evaluate public opinion as it relates to economics. So stuff like the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey, to an extent, the Conference Board's survey, and I think this would also include any of like the political polling surveys as well from folks like YouGov, or what we're doing at Strength in Numbers and Verisight. That these evaluations are biased um, by some force, and it does seem to be a nebulously defined force, um, of some amalgamation of like social media, people seeing posts on Reddit. I mean, there's some Reddits you go on and it's people like just complaining about prices for the entire Reddit. So maybe it's that, or maybe it's news coverage, but there's some sort of media coverage, social or news, as driving sentiment down. So this disconnect between what we observe, which is that the economy is objectively good, and perceptions, which are bad, can be attributed not to something like the statistics being wrong, but to people misunderstanding the economics, being irrational about the state of the economy today. So, as part of this counter argument, you also have the claim that the economy is great right now. It's good. It's been great since 2024 or so, when inflation went back down to 2%, 3%, and everyone's just irrational. I think that's. I think I'm covering all the bases. What do you think?
Right? It's almost as if like economists are gaslighting, the public to say, "Oh, actually, things are fine. Stop, like that grocery bill that you got, you're overly worried about it, and we're living actually in a great world, and you should." you should be happier about the world, that you're in.
Yeah, and there is a good amount of scolding, right? Like, "Oh, you, the American people, are just misunderstanding the state of the economy right now. Look, this statistic that is calculated by the BLS in the basement of a federal building that's 200 years old in Washington, D.C., is like the arbiter of truth in the economy, and our aggregated perceptions are what's wrong. It just seems like the reverse. It seems like the entire reason polling exists is so that we can see when there are differences between what people are telling us and what other data or stories that aren't rooted in data, just narratives, will be telling us about what the people believe. And the whole point is that we're supposed to take the people at their word.
And I think what was so interesting that you kind of, revealed in, that, 3,000 word piece was breaking down this narrative of, not just like it's the economy stupid, but it's prices stupid, right?
Mm.
That there's actually this very specific part that people are incredibly worried about. And you kind of uncovered that there's like this very clear poll that is this really strong indicator about how people feel about the economy and about how they're going to think about what's going on in the like policy and political environment there. So can you talk a bit about like what that testing process was like, how you like really kind of distilled this down to prices? And I think even there's that nuance there too about not just, gas or grocery prices, but, a little bit more specificity there.
Yeah, sure. So if the claim is that aggregate economic statistics right now should be predicting a University of Michigan Consumer Index reading of 90, believe that is basically what you would expect based off of CPI growth, inflation at 2 or 3%, S&P 500 annual growth of 20% or so, and other aggregate level economic statistics, you would expect a consumer confidence of that is very high, like near the historical highs. Um, my claim is that these models just omit a very key variable, which is price level, not price change. And basically over the past 5 years, a measure we call excess prices. Um, and this excess price measurement is measured as whatever today's CPI reading is, the actual level of prices relative to what you would have predicted prices today to be based on what inflation was in the preceding 10 years. And that is calculated in a rolling window. And if you do that basically, and you compare our predicted price based off of like data from the past 10 years to predicted price today, what you're doing is looking at the difference between what people would have been expecting roughly to pay based off of the inflation that they had been experiencing in their own lives
Right.
the past 10 years and what they actual got. So you're measuring like long-term inflation and inflation. This is the second derivative. This is the long-term excess prices. And the key is that this 5 to 10 year lag in the prediction of what prices should be creates a measure of excess price that does not just fade like in a year, like the actual government inflation indexes fade in a year, which would of course be based like if your prediction is that consumers should forget about inflation in a year. I don't have to tell you, like, you don't talk to people who have to buy milk, basically, like, that's just, like, people do not
Yeah.
forget about price increases in a year, and I think that's what we ended up finding.
Right. And I think there's some part of that that, people, we do all the time, right? Where you're like, well, I maybe think my rent is going to go up 3 or 4%, but I also think my, income might go up 5%. And so I actually think I'm going to be, okay for covering my costs. I know you and I have also chatted about being new dads and the cost of childcare that you kind of like expect
Oh,
to
it's
go up
terrible, man.
at different things. Yeah, and you're like, those are things you don't forget about, you're calculating all the time, and I think also that brutal shock that a lot of people feel mentally, like, that really sticks with you, especially, like, when you're, yeah, in the voting booth or you're, kind of raging online and on Reddit or Twitter and things like that.
Right. Yeah, so I also looked at the counterargument itself. We have survey data on on the in one variable, uh, what people say, how people rate the economy today in terms of its growth. Do you think a couple different questions in our survey? Do you think the country's on the right track? Do you Are you paying more than you were paying a year or 2 years ago? What do you think inflation will be a year from now? And we add those together to create a index of economic sentiment right now, and then we just plotted that against how much you consume the news and how much you post on social media. Because if the claim is that people are spending a lot of time on Reddit getting influenced basically
Mm,
by other people who are upset about how prices, then they would be upset about prices. Or if they're watching the news coverage all the time, seeing the inflation statistics, but the inflation statistics are good, so like the logic doesn't really work. But they're just seeing headlines about how expensive things are, then they will be then they will issue their own negative reading of the economy. Um, then you would expect the relationship between consuming news and posting to be negative, to predict lower sentiment readings. We actually found this to be completely the opposite.
so the
People who spend more
more
time watching the news, people who post more, rated the economy as better. So whatever fantasy mediating variable there is out there that's causing
assessment.
everyone's vibe vibe session vibe session 2.0, doesn't actually appear to be in the data. So even if you don't believe what we're saying about excess prices, unfortunately, I think you still have to conclude that the counter argument, the explanation for the counter argument, doesn't hold either. So maybe you end up in the situation where you're just sort of throwing your hands up and being like, "Hey, the survey data doesn't make any sense. People should be happier." I think we do have a pretty good understanding based on talking to actual people, and that is the University of Michigan's question where
Right.
they ask people, "Have your prices gone up in the last year?" And like 70% of people say yes. I think it really can be as simple as that.
Is this an issue though of like media headlines in some ways, or the types of data that we are reporting, right? Where it's, headline inflation, it's, these top line unemployment numbers where a lot of people just see that they get that New York Times push notification, but they aren't going back to realize that, we've lost, right? Those numbers have been revised down in 21 out of the last 30 months, right? We've lost over a
Right.
million jobs that were initially reported. Like, is some of this just that we're, you know, people are consuming bad information and that's what's making them feel better about the economy? Or second, are the things that, the Fed and Treasury and BLS are reporting like not actually good measures of what's going on in the economy? Should they be reporting more things like how many people are using buy now, pay later for groceries? Should they be talking more about like,
That'd be
the
interesting.
hidden
Yeah.
in-home costs of childcare that often don't get reported, things like that?
I think it's plausible that, a three years of negative economic news from roughly 2021 to 2024, um, or I guess mid 2022 through 2024 because of the election season, I think created some bad incentives on the part of Fox News, for example, created an enduring perception that the economy was bad. Uh, that's totally plausible, but it doesn't account for economic sentiment now being at its all-time record low, at least according to the University of Michigan.
Right.
Um, some things that might account for that are like the partisan makeup of the University of Michigan survey. Seems like it might have too many Democrats in it. It doesn't account for that. But that still doesn't explain why independents in particular also have a consumer sentiment reading right now that is as low as the Great Recession. So at some point you come to the conclusion that there is a disconnect between the aggregate statistics and sentiment, and you can either believe some non-experts on Twitter or Blue Sky who are claiming that this is all a mass hysteria on the part of like 300 million people or 200 million adults, or you can buy the very simple explanation that people are telling us the truth and the aggregate statistics aren't measuring what the naysayers claim that they're measuring. And so now we get to an answer of your question. I think the aggregate economic statistics just like aren't measuring stuff that is now correlated with sentiment that didn't used to be correlated with sentiment.
Right.
So, if you build these historical models that predict what sentiment would be from 1970 to 2006 or so, you will get you know inflation and the Fed funds rate all predicting uh, sentiment very well, and then it doesn't anymore. Well, there's never been a cumulative price shock that of the scale of COVID, basically, in that time period. So we are in an out of sample forecasting period now, trying to explain sentiment using the things that would have historically predicted sentiment. Maybe it's just that like the historical rules don't apply post COVID, or post COVID is just kind of a proxy here for the big excess price shock we saw from 2020 to 2024.
I think you've spent kind of a big portion of your career trying to identify those areas, though, where we're missing a lot of those, where the aggregate numbers don't tell the full picture. At American Inequality, we really try and dig, past the state level to show what is going on in, counties, because what's happening in northern Texas is so different than what's happening in southern Texas, and I know you've also done quite a bit of writing about immigration here too. But I think it was also in 2016, you had talked quite a bit about like how we had over indexed on polling of educated Americans that maybe, made Hillary look like she was, further ahead than not. Like, are we always in times of anomalies? Like, is our aggregate polling always missing the picture, or does COVID really make it feel like that was, so anomalous? And where have we been able to like learn our lessons from the past to actually improve some of this more, local approach to understanding what's going on in different communities?
Well, I think it would be awesome if we had like an army of I mean the way polling was conducted in like the 40s is George Gallup would send his army of interviewers out in person to interview people, and you could get a geographically representative sample if you tried hard enough by sending them to the right place. Now in reality there were a lot of neighborhoods that got missed. Black neighborhoods in New York City, Harlem got missed a lot, for example. And there were some scandals in the early polling years about this that basically forced them to, over time, also adopt more convenient ways of interviewing people, the phone, later random digit dialing. Um, and now basically none of those work anymore. And we're back at the point in polling now where the most accurate survey is like the most simple technology you've ever heard of, Jeremy. Snail mail. You
Really?
could get a 30% response rate. Yeah, this is according to Pew's benchmark polling. If you benchmark polling, I mean they do a big survey every year over the mail. They call it their opinion reference survey. Um, they come they do the entire sampling over snail mail. They send out thousands, tens of thousands of pieces of mail inviting you to take a survey. And you can take it online or you can ignore it. And if you ignore it, P will send you another piece of mail, postcard, or letter to sort of scale up how intense they are every time.
Have
And they
you
say,
ever gotten
"Please
a
take our
letter?
survey." No, I've never gotten a letter, but I used to work there. They
Yeah.
say, "Please, please take our survey." And then they'll say, "Please take our survey. Here's money." And then they'll send you a first class envelope that says, "Please take our survey. Here, we printed the whole thing out. Just fill it out and send it back to us." If you do all that and you spend the millions and millions of dollars that it takes to research that sort of program, you can get a poll of 30% response rate. But the stuff that I do, stuff that everyone else is doing, has a response rate of like 1% at best or less. So the types of people we're getting on the phone are like statistical freaks. They just really like to talk about politics or the economy, and that can lead to problems like the people who you were talking to. Uh, maybe they are exposed to the news too much because they're office workers that can watch the news and also take a poll if you call them. We really I think we really have a bad understanding of political questions that aren't related to partisanship anymore, or any questions that aren't related to partisanship. As we've seen in the last couple of elections, even doing stuff like balancing your survey based on the number of Republicans in it can still lead you like 2 or 3 or 4 points off of something that's really important.
Sorry,
Now in
you're
the case
saying
of surveys,
the actual question that's asked is too partisan, or the group of people that are asked the question in general are, like, too
yeah, the
partisan as well?
latter. Yeah, the latter. I mean, you there's also the problem of the former, which is a lot of polling that, like, a lot of polls are junk, um, designed by organizations that want a certain result or companies that are paying out the nose for, market research to greenlight a marketing program. They don't really care about the result as long as it's, "Yes, do what you've already do the program you've already developed," for the most part. Um, like, polls came out of confirmation bias, uh, in market research in the 30s and 40s. It's really not a surprise that that's what companies Coca-Cola would use it for example. But what I'm actually talking about is in political surveys, at least if we're making the jump to talking about political surveys, uh, the problem is you can balance your poll by party or by past vote, get the right number of Trump supporters in it, whatever. But that only helps you if supporting Trump is predictive of the question you're asking. If it's not, and the thing that's predictive of the question you're asking is, you know, some sort of engagement bias or like how often you go to the movies, balancing your poll by Trump support isn't gonna help you. And so
Right.
there's probably a whole sea of questions for which we have a biased reading of the public at the national, but especially the state and subnational level, um, that we're all kind of flying blind because the response rate for surveys is so low, and the correlates of non-response to be statistical here are unknown. That is uh, an area worth doing some more research on.
So you and I both love charts. We love a data visualization. And I think, in particular, when we put these things out in the world, like people love a clean chart. They like a narrative that they can kind of, see in that. But I think as you're making quite clear that, the data is inherently messy. What do you think is sort of like the biggest lie by omission that, data journalists often have in this place where they're trying to package these complex, statistical stories, but there's so much uncertainty and they want to instead make it neat and digestible? Is it that there's so much of this is only that you're actually looking at 1% of people, or there's a much, I don't know, more challenged thing that they're actually putting underneath the surface?
I don't know. The biggest lie in polling coverage is just certainty, um, especially in the election horse race. Reporters who aren't schooled in all the ways that a poll could go wrong are very likely to take and report on surveys of low quality, um, which is actually a problem that's getting better because there's fewer state level organizations that cover news now to buy low quality polling because unfortunately they've all gone out of business.
Mm,
But it does have the positive consequence of not providing so much, junk polling that's sold to these organizations on the
what's that?
promise of news coverage.
Right.
Um, but the bigger problem is people they don't take the normal margin of error seriously in a survey. The 3% or so statistical error that you get of interviewing 1,000 people to represent, 250 million voters or 330 million people, or at least I guess 280 million adults. Typically, we don't talk about the opinions of children, which would be interesting. Um,
Give voice to the kids.
yeah, we don't know if the kids are all right or all left.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also a whole lot of other error. Like I'm talking to you now about non-response error, that we don't know how to measure until we observe an election and can tell if the survey was wrong. But that's only, electoral, political non-response error that we can detect. There could be non-response error about the economy, evaluations or perceptions of the economy or how much people watch news. I mean, we really just have no idea if we're measuring anything that is correlated to some benchmark that we don't have in the population, right? Because the census isn't going to ask. Actually, the census might ask how often people go to the movies, but even technically, even if the census is asking that, that's not a true percentage because they don't interview everybody. So you still don't know. The point is, if you ask the average reporter, they're not gonna have a conversation like this about, maybe polls are 3 or 4 points off on extra just because we don't know about the, like, partisan or other important makeup of our survey because they don't know how to talk about that. They don't know about correlates of non-response, or, and this is maybe the more pressing problem, they don't have the space to write about it in their articles because an editor doesn't want, like, 200 words at the end of every piece about maybe everything we know about elections is actually 4 points wrong. Like, you just can't.
Right.
As a journalism problem.
Yeah, and I think also just how people perceive statistics too, like this desire that we want to view certainty in statistics, that when we see an 85%, that feels like 100% to us, as well. I think there was a good, moment of people when so many of the polls, kind of had, really made the point of like we hadn't gotten things wrong about Hillary. We just said that in this many times with this many election, running under these scenarios, like she would have won in this many times, but she didn't win, this time instead. But I also think like, I don't know,
Well,
Elliot.
people just expect too much from the polls. I mean, it's kind of paradoxical, but, like, I spend a lot of my time arguing for people to lower their expectations for surveys, um, not because they're not accurate or accurate enough for democracy, but because people just expect them to be perfect. And I don't know if this used to be a problem, in the '90s or early aughts, because I was 4 years old, but it's definitely a problem between 2012 and 2016, or maybe even still, uh, because there were election forecasters out there saying they could predict every single election correctly. Like, we're gonna dethrone the old electoral race raiders and the pundits and the news media because we have polls. We have scientific analysis of survey data. We're always going to be right because we have that data because it could never be, it couldn't have a uniform bias to the level that our predictions would be wrong.
So
That
let
was just
let
like a real hubris of the forecasters. The pollsters were really mad at statistical election forecasters for making those claims in like 2008 and 2012. I believe there were even some debates. I'm just recollecting here, so don't quote me on it. I believe there were even some debates about sanctioning Nate Silver over forecasting. And that was a correct instinct on behalf of the pollsters. Like, he really set up, and other people like him, expectations for forecasting and accuracy of polls that were, like, way too high, and he's basically spent the last decade arguing for lower, uh for people to take it less seriously, that he was right for giving Trump a 30% chance of victory. Like, people still wanted that number to be, like, higher than 30,
Right.
or maybe more to the point, they still expected 30 to be 0, in large part because of, the claims that we were gonna get 51 out of 51 states correct in perpetuity after 2012. The expectations were just off.
Well, let's trace then that kind of historical thread to the present day where we kind of, moved from some of these older models to the election forecasters, whereas today, Elliot, we have this new band of brothers in the prediction markets where people are now putting their actual money where their mouth is. It's not just, someone who's willing to pick up the phone or fill out that, first class envelope. Like they're actually invested in this. It's a huge pool of people. They come from so many different, walks of life. Are Kalshi and Polymarkets like this new thread of being able to, integrate and better understand some of this? Because I think a lot of people would say that they are. A lot of others would say that it's also like this very specific set of people that leaves it out. I've got a sense that I
Yeah.
think I know where you stand on this position, but it would be great to hear, why or why not. These are actually good, measures of what's going on in the economy.
Well, the prediction markets are only as good as the incentives for the participants in the market. Um, so if you were, if you've set up a prediction market of academics and the incentive is pretty narrow, like performance, and maybe you get a small reward out of that, and the size is really important here. Um, or like everyone is participating because they want to have super forecasting, which would be, in the case of like the Tetlock good judgment type forecasting or
Yeah.
Metaculus would be another sort of crowdsourcing forecaster today.
When I worked
Those in
when I worked at the Fed, super forecasting was one of the required reading books on my team.
it is a great book.
Great book, a lot of fun.
I think it's on the shelf behind me on the bottom right.
Nice.
So like, fair enough. Um, but the markets that we have today, the prediction markets, the commercial prediction markets in particular, Kalshi and Poly market, do not have those incentives. They are not incentivizing the most accurate predictions as possible from their participants. They are incentivizing gambling. They're incentivizing making the most money as possible. And the reason I say that is because when you log on to predicted or sorry, Polymarket or Kalshi, the bet is not presented to you as a percentage odd. It's presented to you in terms of the payoff of the bet. You go to Kalshi and to put some $100 down on a 10-cent outcome. It tells you $1,000 plus 1,000. It doesn't tell you 10-cent outcome. Um, so that incentive is wrong, and then it also incentivizes you to bet as much money as you possibly can. There's no limits, and that produces some mispricing potentiality in the market, where a whale with a lot of conviction can outvote everybody else, and that is even at the scale of Polymarket in 2024, which I believe was in the billions of trade volume, was still a problem with this one trader
Right.
in France,
In France, yeah, I remember
the
that.
French whale,
Yes.
putting you know tens of millions of dollars in really quick succession bets and moving the market. I mean, I believe the estimate is that if that person didn't have the amount of money in the market that they had, the market would have been like 3 or 4 points different in its assigned probability. So that's just to say, like, the incentives are not what you would want for a market that is maximally truth seeking, to maybe use, like, unfortunately, Elon Musk's terminology. Uh, but the other problem is that, like, if you just look at the performance of these markets, even abstracting away the theoretical concerns, they aren't as accurate as the boosters claim. And if you go on Twitter and like you look up the guys who work politics for Kalshi, they like to say that they've predicted the outcome of
Right.
every election before it was called. It's like, well, yeah, but that's because the market runs after the results are known, but before
Right,
the
it's like
FEC calls
flips
the
immediately,
election.
right? Yeah, it's like
Yeah, they're like, "Oh, the Kalshi called it right." It's like, "Okay, but what about, like, a week before?"
yeah.
If you start doing these exercises looking at the accuracy of the market a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the election, it actually seems to be, for all these big prediction markets, worse than a well-calibrated statistical model based on the polls over the long term. That wasn't true in 2024, maybe because of the French whale and the presidential level, um, but it was true in 2022 and pretty much every year before that as well. When and in 2022, the problem was that the prediction markets overestimated Republicans based on the traders' theory that polls were always going to underestimate Republicans, and they didn't that year. And that was something a statistical model could have told you, but you can't get that information out of the prediction market because you don't know like the data generating process of the prediction market. You can't ask people for their rationale. You just see a price. So I would caution against taking the prediction markets. Um, I would caution against taking the prediction markets at face value.
Um, I wanna talk a bit about, what you had chatted about with, Paul Krugman, I think it was last week now. I just tried to drop the link into the chat, but ended up just putting in gobbledygook there instead.
I
Because I think here you
was trying to
had
figure out if you said we're trying to tell him thank you or something.
yeah, I was like, one of the several technical difficulties we've had with this, I think there you had talked a little bit about, how politicians are actually increasingly or kind of more notably responsive to public opinion polling, that they actually are following what people are saying, that they care about it, that they, are actually making change for this. And this was something that, like, when you were talking about it, I was feeling hopeful about America. This was like one of these nice things that they're like,
Let's
oh, we
go.
exactly. I was like, they're paying attention. There isn't this massive disconnect where they're just so beholden to wealthy donors or corporations, and that Citizens United hasn't totally been this like massive inflection point in our, democratic process. Um, One, I want to confirm that you think that this is like that it's not that they're responsive to public opinion polling and not just like these prediction markets that we were talking about. And two, did you also walk away with that same like feeling of hopefulness when you kind of wrote that piece where you're like, wow, maybe there actually is a way where my, you know, state, local, federal politician is actually listening to me and I'm able to like get them to vote in the way that is aligned with my, beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, uh, there's there's some good news and some bad news. Um, the good news is that, you know, American politics or democracy is probably working better than you think. Um, the bad news is it's not working as well as it should, and I I will unpack that in a couple ways. So, I also did this big podcast interview. Well, I actually recorded it before my daughter was born and was supposed to post it on paternity leave, but didn't get around to editing it,
Yeah.
which I know you are familiar with that struggle,
Very much
Jeremy.
so. No
Um,
more relevant
so
words for
it finally went up on Monday. That was a conversation with a political scientist named Peter Innes, who has reanalyzed some of the landmark data on how often people get what they want from their government and whether or not, in particular, the poor and the middle class have a say that is either on equal footing or higher than the rich. The 20th percentile and above by household income in particular. And the good news from that conversation for people in brief is that our conventional understanding of this, which was covered in the Daily Show and Rachel Maddow, that the rich always win, is wrong. They win maybe half of the time, which again, you're pitting 20% of the population against the 50% in the middle. So maybe you can come up with some calculation to say, oh, that should actually be like a 50% difference favoring the middle. But at the very least, we do have to acknowledge that I think new statistical understanding of that old political science data, which is that the old the old understanding is wrong. Um, and if the middle class and the poor want something, and the rich also want it, that thing tends to happen about 70% of the time, I believe. And if the poor and the rich disagree, the poor actually are getting what they want about half the time, which is like better than zero, I guess. Maybe you would want that number to be 70% or 50, what have you, but 50% is pretty good. Um,
but
but
you're
the
still
bad
saying
news is that, yeah,
it's not necessarily representative of the broader
it
population.
might
So
not be
even
where we want it to be, but it is definitely not where people thought it was.
got it,
Where the
yes.
claims were, which was basically that the poor never get anything, any policy when they disagree with the rich, and that is an incorrect reading of that data. Um, the bad news is that no one can really quantitatively study how much like Jeff Bezos matters, how much the top, tenth of 1%, how often they get what they want when they disagree with everybody else. And I think we can reasonably speculate about this looking at Citizens United or corporate tax treatment over the past 50 years, or just like how much wealth these people are able to hoard at the expense of everyone else, not to get, progressive or anything. We can
It
reasonably
doesn't seem like
speculate
we
that
should
that
do
group
that
is
in
getting
American
what they
inequality.
want.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. A conversation about American equality is gonna be super Republican.
Yeah.
Um, but we can reasonably speculate that, like, Jeff Bezos is getting what he wants more than one person should get what they want out of the American government, and there are a lot of people out there who say they can't afford their, basic household goods. They don't have an emergency fund that lasts, more than a month. They're having a hard time. They feel anxious or depressed or suicidal because of their economic situation. And in the ideal democratic society, that wouldn't happen. So that's the bad news, I think. Uh,
Yeah.
but then there's the other side of this, which is in terms of things not being as we would like, which is sort of Trump and Republican Party specific right now, and that is the question of whether or not Donald Trump in particular responds to public opinion surveys, because he seems, very narcissistically involved with boosting his own personal approval rating. When his approval rating goes down, he goes on Twitter rampages or whatever it's called, Truth Social, his social media website, and says, "Oh, my polls are actually the best they've ever been, guys. They're the best polls anyone's ever had. They're great." Which is kind of how he is paying attention to the surveys when they're really bad. Uh, and there's some responsiveness, just to take some examples over the last year, in terms of ICE deployments to U.S. cities or immigration policy. Back in March, Axios reported that the White House was telling Republicans to stop using the words mass deportations. And I believe if you look at congressional communications, they have taken note of that. That is a level of responsiveness or reactivity, to use the political science terminology, sort of turning of the policy thermostat in the right direction. The magnitude is not where we want it to be. Certainly, policy is still far to the right of what the average American person would want. And I'll just say one more thing. There is a lot of literature, and I've been writing, thinking about how to write about this recently, that shows the average state legislator and the average congressperson dramatically overestimate conservative support for conservative policies
Mm.
among their constituents, both their registered voter constituents and also the adult population in the district, which tends to be more liberal, and a lot of the people who don't vote tend to be more liberal.
Even when
And
they're
that
in a liberal or conservative region?
Yeah, it's sort of like I believe, a uniform shift. There's just everyone, regardless of where they come from, overestimate support for conservative policies if they're in government. So that would suggest the influence of stuff, or groups like the super rich, maybe business groups, they're exerting a gravitational pull away from sort of more progressive ideas, even when they have majority support from constituents. So that, Democratic link is not perfect there, and it points in one direction. It's not that there's variance. It is reliably that legislators overestimate support for Republican positions, and people don't talk about that enough.
Yeah, and I think, you maybe hear small whispers of it, like in NIMBYism or like those viral photos of community board meetings and like, people who kind of attend those. But I think what's interesting, from, the work that, you were doing and sort of the conversation with Peter Enns is that you can get these public opinion polls regardless of like who's coming, and writing into your office or going to your big speaking events, and you can actually see some of the data on, what people's views are, and yet you still overestimate, some of those conservative views. I think it also
Yeah,
shows like, kind of linking back to this part of like, disconnects in the economy. You also have this disconnect in the political process as well, where you think that the rich control everything, that everything is dominated by corporations, that,
yeah,
elites, pull all of the levers of, the policy process. And I think, what you're saying is that that isn't true, that people also overestimate that they feel more disconnected from the policy process than they, ought to be. And I think there's, I live in, Brooklyn in New York City, and there's kind of this fascinating thing going on right now. Um, where people have very, strong opinions one way or the other about Zoran, but he's doing this thing right now where people basically like tweet at him, or post something on TikTok in the morning about a pothole or how hot a subway station is. And they take the subway home in the afternoon and there's a fan where they had been standing, and they go back to the street and the pothole is, filled. And this idea that like no issue is too small for government to take on, and that there is like this direct connection that you can have to, politicians and policymakers. And I think that is a powerful thing that's like not, doesn't need to be unique to, you know, Democrats or democratic socialists, or progressives, but that a lot of
for
people
sure.
appreciate that there's like this real connection that you can draw to your politician, even your local politician, to like, show responsiveness to their needs.
Yeah, there's a lot of good government opportunity on the right as well. There's a gulf between, I think, the good government that, we want our Republican leaders to be providing. I'm from Texas, for example, and the state government has done very little about a emerging water crisis in my home city of Corpus Christi that, like, will be running out of water soon, because there's lots of industrial manufacturing that takes water from the people, and there's, there were aquifers there, but they've been drained so much that the seawater has permeated the aquifer, rendering the aquifer saltwater and therefore useless. Um, and there's very little being done about that by the Republican leaders of the city or the Republican leaders of the state. And that's just like table stakes. Water is just table stakes. All politicians should want to provide water, regardless of their political ideology. All New Yorkers should be happy that there are fewer potholes, and that's just going to be an easy win for like a mayor who doesn't, who really doesn't sweat the small stuff. He seems that as really important, visible outputs of government. And we definitely see that gulf in terms of the Republican presidency.
Yeah, very much so. And I think the corruption and cronyism makes people feel even more disconnected. But yeah, I have we chatted a little bit about this, but in my, book that's coming out next year, I actually talk quite a bit about water in Texas and this one county in particular that was basically able to like realize and read the writing on the wall about loss of water, kind of this big manufacturing boom and basically how to, help people in the face of all of these issues of, yeah, climate change, immigration, unemployment, and all of that. So lots more to talk about there. I want to wrap us up though with the question that we always end with, kind of on the American Inequality Substack, which is around the path forward and things that we can kind of do to, address some of these, issues that we have discussed, because I think there's no shortage of, challenges in the world, but trying to make sure that people recognize that there are solutions to these. So, in the world of, public opinion polling, whether it's around, like data fidelity and what we need to see, or this issues of how we can make sure that people feel deeply connected to the policy and political process, what do you see as solutions that the private sector or nonprofits or the public sector or kind of data journalists can do to help people realize that change is possible, that we can still sort of have hope that America can move on an upward path towards more opportunity and prosperity?
There's a lot of, just on the note of data journalism, maybe I'll start there. There's a lot of coverage of polling that is entirely horse race, but this is a good opportunity to shout some people out who cover the issues. And CNN's polling team does an excellent job of this. In particular, Ariel Edwards Levy and Jenna Jesta do an excellent job of making sure, I think the second or largest cable network in America has issue polling, not just horse race stuff. And they write a lot of stories about some pretty niche issue polling results and crosstabs on, maybe the most viewed news website in the world besides New York Times. That's huge. They deserve props for that. And I would be remiss if I did not give them credit. Uh, New York Times also does a good job with its issue polling. Some of the people there used to be at Pew. So I think maybe the answer, I feel like I'm coming to my head now, is like there are some news organizations out there that have hired people who are steeped in polling and like the democratic purpose of all this. And those news organizations do great. And then there are news organizations that are seeking, clicks, and they tend not to do polling in what I would call the right way. So in terms of private journalism enterprises, that's what I would say there. Uh, the Pew Research Center, from thinking from the nonprofit perspective now, does a really great job of asking an insane number of questions about American political life and non-political life.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more money that I imagine people could spend on the exact same thing, and I really don't think you can have enough stories about what people want from their government, and especially about, what they say their problems are. And there's also not enough experimentation about allowing people to express what their problems are, so that we could use that information, funnel it to lawmakers, and at least have some objective data to fight for the people with. I say at the end of my book that a real, like, well-funded nonprofit organization. Oh, sorry, and Pew Research also doesn't do, like, congressional advocacy. They just publish the numbers.
Right.
And then the next step is public polling firm, maybe you ask fewer questions and, like, you don't spend the $10 million on the mail poll we talked about earlier. You spend some amount of money on congressional correspondence and lobbying as well, like, actually just for whatever the public thinks. And I think that would do a lot of good, and it's especially missing in Washington, DC. We could even, think about what that would look at the state houses, where you might have even higher leverage convincing lawmakers using information that really doesn't exist otherwise. It's at the state or local level. Um, so that's a problem. I don't know if there are funders on the call, but that's where I would direct money for, for nonprofits. That'd be a good experiment at the very least for a couple years.
Well, I'm sure there are some funders on the call, and I dropped in your, Substack link, so everyone should get in touch with Elliott Morris so he can figure out, how to, connect policymakers with public opinion polling and get some change to happen in this world. But I think it was, also important to shout out, all the other folks who are doing tremendous work. And I think you're absolutely right that this link to the democratic process for giving people voice, for helping, policymakers across all levels of government understand, what people need is an absolutely critical part in making sure that we can kind of advance our goals of opportunity and prosperity and make sure people realize that they actually do have, a voice and that, showing some of that information, not just through nice charts and maps, can really, start moving the needle on some of this stuff. So, Elliot, I am so
Excellent
grateful that
summary, Jeremy. Thank you.
you joined us. Everyone should go check out Strength in Numbers and 50 Plus One. I am Jeremy Ney from American Inequality, and I will be posting this all soon for you also. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, everyone.